Hello! Welcome to day 2 of Confetti Industry Week 2021. Today's session, the 9 AM session, is with Jacob Mills, who's going to be talking to us about his experiences in the games industry and his journey in the games industry. I'd ask you to please use the Q&A function to ask questions, which we'll get to at the end of the session. There'll be a time for Q&A, but rather than using the chat function throughout the talk, we'd prefer it if you use the Q&A function to ask those questions. And if you can, while Jacob's doing his talk, if you can not use the chat function, as it can be a distraction for guests and other viewers. We hope you enjoyed today's session, and a massive thank you to Jacob for being here today, this early in the morning as well. 9 AM is always a big stretch for people, on our 15th Confetti Industry Week. Don't forget as well, there are plenty of other events going on, and you can still book into those events on the Industry Week's website, iw.confetti.ac.uk. And make sure that when you do book in, that you sign in with your Confetti email or your NTU email address. Just let you know, if you sign in with a personal email address, it will be filtered out and you won't get access to the event. So it's really important that you do sign up with your Confetti emails. As part of Confetti Industry Week 2021, we're also running a competition where you can win some really good prizes. All you've got to do is tag us on Twitter or Instagram with the tag #IW21 and share your experiences throughout the week, and be a little bit creative. Maybe take a picture of your laptop screen with some things in front of it, or do something cool. You're art students, a lot of you, so it'd be helpful to use your creativity to win a competition and win some cool prizes. Jacob, just a quick reminder that you need to stay on the call at the end when we boot out all those pesky students, and we are going to have a short debrief chat. And now, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jacob.
Brilliant, thanks very much. Am I on?
You are.
Okay,
you are loud
cool.
and clear.
Brilliant. I will share my screen. Hopefully you can all see my slides. Let me know, because otherwise... Yeah. Okay, great. I will dive right in then. Hello, everyone. I am Jacob Mills. I'm a level designer at Roll7. I'm going to be talking today a little bit about my journey into design in the games industry and what the role of a level designer actually entailed once I got there. And I've got an awful lot of content, so I'm going to try and dive straight in. So a little bit about me, just so you know who I am and why I feel like I'm qualified to talk about this stuff, or, you know, why I feel like I can get away with it. So I'm currently a senior 3D level designer at Roll7. If you don't know who Roll7 are, they're a UK-based, all-remote company. They made Ollie Ollie and Ollie Ollie 2 and Laser League and Not a Hero. So a few little games that you may have played. Very cool studio, very exciting. Before that, I was a level designer at Ubisoft for about 3 years, working on Tom Clancy's The Division 2 in Ubisoft Leamington, so again in the UK, and very briefly Far Cry 6 at the end of last year, working remotely for Ubisoft Toronto. And then before that, I was a hub designer at TT Games. So they make all the Lego games. So I worked on about 1 million Lego games, including Lego Dimensions, Lego Marvel again. And Lego Dimensions, if you don't know, it was one of the Toys to Life games, and it had a billion different properties like Scooby-Doo, Simpsons, Mission Impossible for some reason, Sonic, all kinds of good stuff. So, yes, this first half of the presentation is going to be about my journey, and I really want to emphasize that is my journey. So my hope is that some of this is applicable to some of you, but not all of it will be, and you'll see why. There was a good bit of luck and circumstance in there. But regardless of that, I hope that you can look at this and kind of see how it aligns to your current kind of trajectory. You can see where things are a little bit messy, and I hope that you take from that there's no like one perfect route in. If I managed it, then you know everyone's got a chance. It's not impossible, is the point. So I'll get started from the very beginning. I finished college in 2018. So I'm actually local. I grew up in Hucknall, but I didn't go to Confetti, sorry. But I finished college 2018. I had pretty good GCSEs, pretty good A-levels, but I had like zero direction whatsoever. I had no idea what I wanted to do for a career or anything like that. A job in games had never really occurred to me until I landed a role as a tester at Free Radical Design, who are, you know, in Nottingham as well. And that's a hell of a leap, to be honest, like going straight from school to that. How did I do it? I'm really sorry. It was through complete luck. So this is what I was talking about before. Like, this is not like a lesson that you can learn, really. The short version is that my friend's dad's bandmate's friend worked at Free Radical. My friend got his interview through that, got the job as a tester, and then through my friend, I did that. So that's completely useless, but it was a great experience. Until 6 weeks later, when we were all unceremoniously laid off, the entire weekend shift. And then 3 weeks after that, the entire company went under and then became Crytek and are now deep silver dam busters. But what I got from that was that there was this avenue that I'd never considered, that I could work in games, and I didn't have to wear a suit and tie to work. You know, like that was like, and it still is my main thing. I'm in my work gear right now. It's just a t-shirt. I know that's really dumb, but that's what's important. And I then thought, all right, so I could actually pursue this as a career. What's my next step? So if you're watching this presentation, you already have a head start on me because you're already doing something that's actually relevant to games. So good job. So yeah, despite being laid off, instead of putting me off the industry, this drew me in, and I went to university. I went to a load of open days and kind of crossed them all off the list one by one until I ended up going to Queen's University in Belfast, which you'll note is like really far away and the course is really long. And the reason for that is that I hated that year after college so much, where I was trying and failing to get a job, apart from that one job, that I wanted to avoid searching for a job again for as long as possible. That worked. So yeah, it was a computer games design and development course, except partway through the design just got dropped. So what it ended up being was a computing course that had a couple of game design modules just thrown in. So it was a good university, a really good computing course, but not an amazing games course. It was very programming heavy. And what the kind of natural lead in for this is that if you, there's just this constant debate of whether university is like good or required or worth it and stuff, right? So I'm going to really quickly kind of go over my take on that, and hopefully you will feel emboldened afterwards, because it's relatively positive. So my take on university, my personal take, a lot of it depends on the university and course itself. So like I say, Queen's was a really good uni, but the course wasn't that great. If you're going to Confetti, that's much more focused on actual game stuff. Great job. Again, a head start on me. As a student, you get out what you put in. Yeah, put the effort in, please. And for me, like really concretely, university provides a few things. First and foremost is structure. If you had a complete like iron discipline and incredible will, you could absolutely learn everything that you could learn at university. But like just the structure that university provides with projects and deadlines and such, I just find that it's super vital. Like, yes, theoretically, hypothetically, you could do it yourself, but like how realistic is that? I don't really know, especially not for me. It does expose you to group work. So I'm sure you've all done some group projects and you have hated it. Well, the sad news is that when you work in the industry, you're working with a bunch of people, and it's really good practice for that. You will learn your red flags and stuff. So pay attention, but also you will learn how to communicate with people, which is super important and something that I'll build on later. And it provides some opportunities. So that's bolded because I'm going to talk about it in a moment, but also this right here, like when I went to Queen's, we didn't have any guest speakers or anything like that. This industry week thing is incredible. Like, you got like the Romeros, you know, amazing. So yes, that's awesome. And you couldn't get that without university. A kind of more wishy-washy one, you get to meet people, not just from your course. I lived with an eclectic group of people, drama students, English students, chemical engineering, medical and stuff. It really broadened my horizons. Like I got involved in these circles that I had no insight into before. I know it's a less concrete one, but like it's really important to me. Like that's a real thing. And a really practical one, some visas to work abroad may require a degree. So that's like a tick. If that's on your mind, it will help. So the opportunities that I had, again, very particular to me. Number one was Infosys. So this is a tech company in India, not a games company, a tech company. Again, it was very circumstantial. It was the first year that Queen's had been talking with these guys about doing internships and stuff, so they took on more students than they otherwise would, and I just snuck in there because I applied, and they thought that my games background would kind of mix well with this kind of UI UX thing that they were doing with semantic search engines. It was the work was fine. Like, yeah, UX, it is related to design-ish. But the real opportunity was, wow, I got to go to India. Wow, for 10 weeks, it was awesome. So here's an obligatory picture of me at the Taj Mahal. Please enjoy, very young, very sweaty. You know, couldn't have done that without university. Number 2 is an actual games placement that I did after 3rd year. So this was part of the course for me because the course was 3 years bachelor, 1 year placement, 1 year masters. This was at Sony Interactive Entertainment. They changed their name in London. Awesome opportunity. This was software engineering test in the test and release team. So again, this is very programmy, computing-y rather than design, but it's a industry job in the thick of it. You're learning those workflows, you're seeing these pipelines, you're chatting with these people on real stuff. And it was a really exciting year to be doing that because I was working on the Vita SDK and then this mysterious thing called Orbis, which was then announced later that year as the PS4. So I was on the ground floor of that, and that was awesome, right? And I couldn't have done this without, you know, it being part of my university course. Also got to work testing Fire Engine. So we had to install all the different configurations of Fire Engine. Fire Engine is Sony's not in-house, well, kind of in-house. It's just an engine that Sony make, but it like works on PC and other platforms as well. Journey was made in Fire Engine, and Ollie Ollie 2, weirdly, and Unravel, and a few other odd games. But that was really cool, and that was my first exposure to like a real industry grade game engine. So that was very cool. And as the kind of bonus perk, there were these cool launch parties. Sony has an incredible canteen. The Last of Us came out that year, and I didn't work on The Last of Us, but we got to go to the launch party, and they had like edible crickets and cakes that looked like little bricks and stuff. So again, just as to give an impression of what my life was like at that point, there was a photographer at the party, and he said, "Hey," and I turned around mid-chew, and I have this picture of this incredible chin, and it never fails to make me smile. So please enjoy that. And I love that picture because it doesn't even show how grandiose this party was. It looks like we're all in the back of a van or something. But there was loads of decoration and stuff. It was awesome. It was awesome. So was university worth it? For me, it's a resounding yes, like absolutely yes. The opportunities alone are a huge part of it, and I couldn't have done that without university. Also, the people I met, like that is genuinely like such an important part of it for me. And yeah, it gave me that foundational knowledge that I could have acquired with really strict discipline and Googling and infinite money. But I couldn't really without, you know, the actual structure and opportunities that university provides. So I graduated, and that's great. But like I say, my course was computing-y, not necessarily gamey. And what I learned as I was applying for jobs after graduating was that my portfolio was not super strong. And this is like the main thing when you're applying for games jobs. Portfolio, you've got to have a portfolio. You've got to have a portfolio. It is so vitally important. And by portfolio, I just mean a website with pictures, videos, demos of game projects, right? Relevant things. So when I was trying to land my first role after graduating, I sent out so many applications. I wrote down a few statistics. I applied for 45 jobs. Out of those jobs, I got 24 replies. Out of those 24 replies, only 8 were positive. The rest were no's, like straight up. And then I did a bunch of technical tests and failed them many times. So I passed my course well, and it had like a lot of programming and stuff, but like the particular things that games required, quite heavy, and I just wasn't super strong at those bits. So I was very lucky my parents could put me up for the interim, right? And so I took that time to kind of restudy C++ in much more gamey terms than I'd done it before. And also I did Game a Week for 10 weeks, and that was super good. These came up in interviews. What's Game a Week? It's very self-explanatory. It's a thing pioneered by Adriel Wallach. She's a game designer that's worked on, well, a million stuff now because she worked on a Game a Week for a year plus. And there's a blog post. I've got a set of links that we shared. And one of her blog posts is in there. So if you want to share them, now's the time. But yes, it's very self-explanatory. You make a game a week, and the idea is to make a kind of finished thing, not like start a thing and then kind of throw it away after a week. Like make your intro, make your gameplay, make your little game loop so you can play again. Maybe there's a leaderboard and stuff like that. The point is, yeah, generate a number of small finished projects, and in your portfolio, you can talk about what you wanted to do, what you set out to do, what you did, and then what you learned. So that first screenshot in the top there, I wanted to make Space Invaders, but like in a circle, and I did that, and it was really interesting. Like the next one, I wanted to make Breakout, but with like physics blocks. That was weird. And the third one, I wanted to make a platformer, and I did. These are some of the good ones. I made 10 in total, and about 5 of them are complete rubbish. But you know, that's that deadline and mixing that with getting interviews and the rest of it. So yeah, I eventually got offered a role at TT Games as a junior game mechanics programmer. So I was applying to jobs from about June to October, something like that. So just to caveat this, like, yes, I'm very lucky my parents could put me up for those 3 months. If I'd been less snobby about what I wanted, I could have widened my net and probably had a lot more success. I was really wanting to get like a console, PC, AAA job. But if I'd gone for mobile, if I'd gone for indie, even if I'd abandoned my dream of getting a games job and just gone for a computing job, I would have had much more luck, I think. And weirdly, when it rains, it pours. Like I got another job, another offer when I got the TT role. So I don't know, you know, after putting in all that effort, all those applications, and then getting to it once, really strange. But sometimes that's how it goes. So don't be disheartened. It took a lot of effort. Yeah. So I spent all this time getting this programming job, thinking that, right, I'll be in the industry a few years and then I'll have made contacts and then I can kind of make the hop over to design. Or maybe I really love programming and I can just get into that. But for me, programming was always a means to an end, and that end was making games. I was always much more interested in the design side. It's just that my course had kind of gone that kind of computing heavy. So I, leveraged those skills and decided to use them. Within the first week, a role for a junior designer went up. And this was I really agonized about that because I'd spent so much effort, getting this first offer, getting this role. Did I want to jeopardize it by going to my manager and saying, oh, I want to work in design instead, like, thanks, but see ya. But I did it. I did it anyway. And it all turned out really well because my manager was really cool with it. I interviewed for the design role, and within 3 months, I was working in design. And that is my route into design. That is how I got my first design job. But again, I must stress that is only one route, and there are so many more. And this is not like typical. There is no one size fits all solution for this. So if you're watching this and thinking, oh God, I haven't done this, I haven't done that, I'm never going to be able to do that, don't worry, because there's so much variance. It's not a linear path, right? It's very much a non-linear path. So some alternate paths that, just from people that I've met in design. Number one, do an actual games design course. So again, if you're Confetti, you already have this huge advantage over me. You already have that head start. Great job. I know people who have gone into level design from art. So environment art and level design, very similar, but often at odds, but I'll get into that. But yes, you can make the leap. QA, so quality assurance testing. If you are embedded in a studio at QA level, you're part of the process, you're part of the pipeline, you're part of the workflow, you're talking to people, you're meeting people. You become familiar with the processes and stuff. You become familiar with what works for design and what doesn't. Like, that's a valid route in. I knew a couple of guys who studied architecture and then came to level design. Architecture is a super useful background to have in level design. Really valuable resource. You don't need a formal education, like I don't. For me, architecture is very much like an interest, not an area of expertise. I'd like to know more, but anyway, I know people that studied architecture and then came to level design. One of my bosses at UB, he got into games way back when, off the back of his Quake levels, like Doom and Quake mods. That's a legit thing. And nowadays there's, more modern games that you can do the same thing with. The point is having a portfolio. You put these things in your portfolio, that gets you cred. Same with any in-game level editor. So we've got like Halo Forge, we've got even Mario Maker, stuff like that. There's a million different paths in. So don't be discouraged, please be encouraged, because mine was very messy, but I got my design role anyway. So I'm just gonna take a quick drink. And then launch into the second part of this chat, which is what is level design as a role? So I spent all that time kind of getting in there. So what actually is the job? And I'm going to kind of take this from a kind of process angle. So if you're basically, there's a lot of resource about actual level design, like blocking out space and that kind of, you can just find that a lot of that. So I want to talk about the bits I didn't necessarily expect or understand when I first got my role. Hopefully just give you a bit of insight into that. So very broadly, what is level design? This is a great question because you will just get a different answer depending on any number of factors, including who you ask, the studio that you're asking, the team within that studio, the game that you're working on within the team within that studio. Like the role is very malleable, and it changes, and it's a very kind of young role in games, which is a young industry, you know. So there's even now there's still it can just vary a lot. Weirdly, the role of level design can change a lot depending on the stage in the project that you're at, and I want you to just remember that because that's going to be important later. Spoilers, but just hold that one in your head. I've got a couple of personal definitions. So yes, the level design is, well, I'll just dive in. Level design is about ensuring players never get lost or frustrated. And so that's what it is at its real core for me, because we are the people who are going in, looking at like what the kind of plan is. Like we want to have this mission or we want to have this level or whatever. And it's like, we want to get the player from A to B. We want them to do these things. We don't want them to ever get to a point where they're like, man, what am I doing? Or this doesn't work, or trying things that don't work, that kind of thing. Little asterisk here. We never want players to get lost or frustrated. If we want players to feel lost, we want to evoke that feeling. If we want players to come up against a challenge that might, we want that, but we never want players to get more lost or more frustrated than we intend. Okay. My personal definition number 2, good level design showcases the game design and game mechanics and provides players with opportunities to utilize these in interesting and exciting ways. So for me, level design is a kind of vehicle for the game design to ride along. We want the mechanics and stuff to really shine in the game, and how we do that is by introducing them and using them in such a way in the levels that really just lets the player experiment, lets the player see them at their best, lets the player play the game the way that we want them to play, but like in the way that makes the game as good as it can be, right? You don't want to make a game with some mechanics in mind and then the levels just don't work with those mechanics. And you will have played games like that and something would have felt not quite right. And that's a real key part of it for me. So a quick recap about me. Like I say, I'm currently working at Roll7. Before that, I worked at Ubisoft on some open world shooters. And before that, I worked at TT Games on some family-friendly Lego games. And you may look at that kind of Ubisoft TT leap and think, well, those are very different. How does the experience from one role transfer over to the next? So in brief, what the role at TT was, it's a lot of fantastical settings. So like I say, Scooby, Simpsons, Sonic, Mission Impossible, involved putting a lot of puzzles in, quests with different characters that send you around, collect 5 flowers or whatever, putting races in these little open worlds, and then odd jobs like someone's got to place all the coins in a level. Who's going to place all the coins? I'm going to place all the coins. That's my job. And then at TT, it's a little bit, if a job needs doing, if you got to wear a hat, wear that hat. So a little bit of narrative design. So I was writing some of the quests, wrote a lot of the Sonic stuff, wrote the first drafts of the Mission Impossible stuff. A little bit of game design. So the focus was really on the Sonic's movement in 2D for his level, but I was working on the open world. How does Sonic move in 3D? So I, chatted with the programmers, took that mantle and drove that kind of design process. So a little bit of everything, a very varied role, a very frenetic role. And yeah, working with these numerous IPs and such. Meanwhile, at Ubisoft, not so fantastical real world settings. So Washington, DC, kind of Cuba-ish for Far Cry. And now we're working on mission content. So what do missions consist of? Well, a bunch of combat and a bunch of navigation. So a very physical style of level design, very much concerned with the shape of these spaces, the layout of these spaces, as opposed to TT. So yeah, even within those two, if I compare the two, you can just see that they're very different. Like on the surface, these are very different games. They require different things. How does level design transfer between those two? And I'll be completely honest, when I went to Ubisoft from TT, it was almost like having to relearn how to do the job again. It was different. It was very different. But different. There are some core requirements that I found transferred from one role to the other, and some kind of things that I found myself doing, which were very familiar. And I can leverage this from TT into Ubisoft into Role 7 now. So number one, there's always a huge element of research. There is an element of planning before you get your hands super dirty. You've got to, you got to figure out what you're doing. There is the design and iteration phase. So if anyone's designed a level before and you're making block out, or you're, blocking out these spaces, that's this kind of phase. Likewise, there's scripting and implementation. So putting in your gameplay elements, putting in your enemies, when do they spawn, putting in your puzzles, if I press this button, what happens, that kind of thing. Finally, polish and bug fixing. So actually making this stuff really sing and good. And then collaboration is a huge part of it, which I'll get into later, but like so much more than I expected. Like I'm an introvert by nature, and I figured getting into games, I'd just be working with a bunch of introverts and I could get along by myself, but that's not the case. I'm sorry. Just quickly looking at those first 5 though, these are just the stage in the project that you're at. And this is what I was talking about earlier, like the role changes with each of these phases. So it was all a huge favor, and I'll go through each one in detail. So number one, research. There's always this element of research. Number one, the genre. You need to know what you're making. Making a family-friendly puzzle platformer is very different to making a open-world shooter. So play some games, watch some Let's Plays. If you're working on Division, play some looter shooters, so play Destiny, and then play some cover shooters, so play Gears of War. Wow, that's the Division. If you're playing Lego stuff, just play a bunch of family games and think, wow, Nintendo make really good games. Know your target audience. This feeds into the last one a little bit, but it can be separate. But yes, making content for mature audiences is very different to making content for families. Know where your level is in the progression of the game. So if you're making a level that's early in the progression, that's very, very different to the middle or the end. Like, are you introducing game mechanics? Do you need to introduce crucial elements of design? Do we want to give players a bit of an advantage if it's an early level? Alternatively, if it's near the end of the game, do we want to really test the player's mastery? Do we want to leave it open so they can kind of choose their approach and figure, they know these mechanics, so let them really show that. Very different. If you're working on something, that's IP heavy, intellectual properties, so like the Lego games, you want to really immerse yourself in these worlds, in these stories. So key locations that we want to reference in the world, key events that we want to reference in puzzles and quests, key characters that we want to be delivering this kind of exposition. So for example, on Lego Dimensions, I worked on the Mission Impossible adventure world, and that means that I watched the Mission Impossible films over and over and over again. And that means that I watched Mission Impossible 2 over and over and over again. And that is a bad film. But you got to watch it because you got to know who's in it, what are the key plot points, what do we want to reference, right? And it is there's so much content there, and with Lego games especially, you can have some levity with it. You're not allowed to make fun of Tom Cruise, but you are allowed to make fun of the properties sometimes, depending on how much the IP holders let you. So you can have some real fun with it. But yes, you're looking for those key things. Alternatively, if you're working on a game set in a real world location, like Division 2 is set in Washington, DC, we're looking for gameplay opportunities. We're looking for landmarks. So Washington, DC, you probably think White House, Capitol, Washington Monument. My chunk of Washington, DC wasn't one of these MVPs. It was a 5x5 block of blocks. And it was just kind of this residential commercial district. But we don't need like the Eiffel Tower to make this place memorable, to make it work, right? So what I did was I literally went through Google Street View, east, west, east, west, east, west, north, south, north, south, north, south, looking around, seeing like, okay, where would be a cool place to have or to have a firefight? Where would be a cool place to have a vantage point and get a drop on some enemies, or a cool place to defend, right? So one example that I've got here is that there was this set of apartment blocks, and I saw that they had all these like disparate rooftops on different levels and stuff. And if you look up the rent on these places, it's unimaginable. But the point is that I thought this would be a really cool opportunity to, if I had like a side mission here, then we could be shooting across this empty space and on different levels and stuff, and it'd be really cool. And that's exactly what we did, and it was really cool. And yeah, we're just looking for places. We're looking for things that we can leverage and say, all right, there's the Chinatown gate, so I know roughly where I am in relation to the rest of the world. We're looking for those things to help ground players and to help them navigate. So after you've done your research, you know what you're kind of working with. you gotta go into this planning phase. And for me, this is working on the tricky problems early. And there's going to be a lot of tricky problems, so it's really good to get them out early before you've spent hours and hours of work putting this stuff in engine. So for me as a level designer, that means align with art. So as a level designer, I want things to play well. I want the gameplay to be really good. I want the player to know where they're going. Artists want the thing to just look phenomenal, right? And these two, even though it may feel like they should go hand in hand, are often at odds with each other. And it requires a lot of conversation just to make sure that you are both getting what you want and that these two things are aligned and working for each other and not against each other. So make sure, like, you can't just throw a bunch of cubes in and say, this is going to be a cave. And then the artists say, well, this doesn't make any sense in this place. This is like a car park. What are you talking about? So do that. Number two, technical limitations. There will be technical limitations, and it's really good to know them early. So talk to your coders, talk to your tech artists if you've got them. And this goes hand in hand with the next couple of points, layout and pacing. So you see the map that I've got there, that's I've drawn over one of the maps of one of my missions in Division. And you'll see that it's got this like long corridor to start with, and then you go into this kind of hub room, and then that goes into these different branches. So this is like a hub and spoke design. But the point is, there's these corridors between the hub and all the different spokes, right? These kind of long corridors. And what that's doing is that I knew that this mission was set in an underground cavern, incidentally. And I knew that we could leverage that setting to spread out these different areas, and that helps with streaming. It helps stuff load in. So as a player, you're not thinking about that, but as a designer, I am from the very beginning, because it just makes all of our lives easier the further on that we go. And it very naturally helps pace the level, because, a little navigation going down a corridor, that's kind of a free downbeat. And it helps the pacing and stuff. So get your layout, your macro layout figured out, and your pacing. Where do I want high intensity? Where do I want low intensity? Where do I want high challenge? Where do I want low challenge? That kind of thing. Really good to figure that out early. And then this often goes hand in hand with documentation. And what you want to do is like write a 100-page Word doc and just hand it to the rest of the team. And then they'll all just read it and they'll be like, oh, that's really good. And now we know what we're doing. And that's it. Psych, I'm being sarcastic. That's a terrible idea. You may work at some studios where they still employ this kind of attitude. But when you're a junior, you can't really change much from the ground up. But I really encourage you to just try your best. But for me, the ideal situation is that documentation is just kind of part of this kind of figuring it out process. It really formalizes some of these tricky problems so that you can't just say, oh, I'll figure out that tricky corner later. No, you figure that out now so that you don't have to figure it out later. So you can see, oh, actually it's impossible, but if we change it like this, we can do this kind of thing, right? And a lot of the time, so working at somewhere like Ubisoft, you will have to kind of pitch this to the directors to get sign off. But regardless, it's really good to have this stuff so that you can kind of drive this for the whole team and say, this is the level that we're making. These are the key beats that I want to hit. And you can start those conversations as early as possible and get yeses or nos, or start conversations about tricky bits, right? With the entire team, art, narrative, tech, VFX, audio, everyone. So that's kind of the value of documentation for me. But it kind of, in an ideal world, you're already starting to block stuff out really roughly, and as soon as possible, your level itself should become a living design document, right? Because as soon as you start putting stuff in, whether you want it to or not, the level in game will change and outgrow the design doc. And so that's where we get to design iteration. So if you are Googling level design, you'll find a lot of guys talking about level design as if this is the only bit. This is all there is. You're blocking out stuff. You're putting cubes in, and of course, it's a like really key bit of the job, right? But I want to emphasize at this point that it is only part of the job, and a really important part, but still just a part. But here is where you're doing that, and ideally you would have started a little bit earlier. But if you're doing, it depends on your tools, it depends on the game, it depends on the team. And you can see that it's a kind of rough version of what the level would turn into. So this is a little side project that I did, make a kind of Last of Us style level. And you want to just show off the really core parts, key beats. And what you're doing is, like I say, this is a living design doc. You want to say to your artists, I want this building in front of us to be really noticeable, really important and stuff. So I colored it yellow. And, I can't just hand that over to artists and say, well, I made it yellow, right? I also have deliberately framed it in the level in such a way and stuff. You figure that out at this stage so that you don't need to figure it out later, because changing a fully arted, finished thing is way more difficult than just changing this thing, which is just a bunch of blocks. So nail the level flow, get your basic enemies and gameplay in here so that you can actually play it. A space will change completely once the gameplay elements are in. So don't just get them in as early as possible. And at that point, you want to bring people, it may feel too early, but like you want to get people in and you want to watch them play. And ideally you watch them play and you ask them to think out loud, because that will just give you this huge insight into what's working and what's not. And more often than not, there'll be just huge swaths of this that aren't working how you think they work. Where do players get stuck? What is unclear to the player? Readability is super important. So one of the links that I've given is this talk by David Shaver, who's a designer at Naughty Dog, and he does this whole thing just about how you can use your, they call it block mesh. There's a million different words for this: block out, white box, gray box, block mesh. It's just this phase of just the rough version. And readability is super important. Get that in as early as possible. It helps your team align on where these important bits need to be. It helps you say, like, you don't need to say, oh, imagine there's a huge window here. You just put a window in and be like, this is the kind of effect that I want, right? And then you listen to all that feedback and you iterate on that level, because it's not going to be perfect first time. It's going to be really far from it. So yeah, you can see here, I've got this kind of level flow where you go into that building and come out, and there's stuff that happens. This is the kind of block out phase. Next, you've got scripting and implementation. And this is kind of concurrent with the previous phase. It's just easier for me to split them out into different slides. So this is, yes, your puzzle logic, your quest logic, or your mission logic, right? When do enemies spawn in? When I press this button, what happens? When does this door open? All this kind of thing. It's really important, again, to emphasize that level design isn't just layout. Depending on how you utilize a space will completely change the experience within that space. So the example that I've got here is, this is that same mission from earlier that I had the map of. So this is the hub room in that mission. And the player has combat in here 3 times. And each time is slightly different. So the first time you come up here on this ledge, so the player has advantage, you've got height on the enemy. The enemy doesn't know you're there, and you can take your time, get into cover, scout your flanking routes, scout your observation points if you want to snipe, or if you want to get close. It's like, all right, I need to go to the left so I can sneak in and shotgun their faces. So that's a very different experience to later on when the player is kind of working on a computer in the middle of the room, and then the smoke grenades come in, and then guys rappel in from the ceiling. So within the same space, it's a completely different experience, because all of a sudden the player is on the back foot. The enemies have the advantage. The player is now, rather than planning, they're reacting. They're working on reflex. And because I've introduced the space to them earlier, they kind of know the layout, so they know where to go, but they're having to do that on the fly. And 2 very different experiences from the one space. And so just in general, how you set up your space with the gameplay elements can change how that space is played. Yes, so keep iterating. And at this point, we want to get the level functionally complete so you can play it from start to finish, and it's really representative. And this is when the handover to artists will happen, or it will already be happening. And yes, this is when you kind of transition into that polish and bug fixing phase. So this is usually like a sprint to the finish, and you're getting content release ready. And as a designer, this is a really scary and kind of difficult part, because this is where your design is being taken out of your hands and into the hands of literally everyone else, whose job is to like finish this stuff and make it really sing and really beautiful. But when things go from that, block out to final, elements can get lost, readability can get lost, your intentions can get lost. So your job is to really monitor this and have these conversations and make sure that these things don't run away from you. So this isn't like a great example, but it's all I could throw together without like breaking any NDAs. But here you can see the concept art of the Sonic Adventure World from LEGO Dimensions and the final art that we ended up with. And the concept art was taken from my lockout and then given that wow factor, and it looks beautiful, it looks amazing. But a real key difference that you'll notice here is that while the finished hub has a little bit of verticality, it's on a little bit of a slope, the concept is really stacked. And this looks great for a concept, but it doesn't play super well, especially with Sonic's movement. And this is the kind of thing that will kind of sneakily get you when you're in this final phase. It's things will change because art or narrative or tech concerns aren't 100% aligned with design. And that's why it's really important to be having these conversations. And it's really important for you as a designer to be safeguarding and championing the design. And this brings me to my final point, and another kind of level design key definition that I didn't say earlier is that a designer is a champion for their chunk of content. You're the driving force for this chunk. And that's why it's a big reason I love this job, despite being an introvert, is that you are tying all these disparate parts together, right? Collaboration is enormously important from start to finish. And you're not just in a bubble, right? You can't just make these, you can't put a cubes in a space and then say, here's the level, finish it for me, and expect an incredible level. You've got to be chatting from start to finish, collaborate as early as possible with as many people as possible. You're responsible for stitching all these disparate parts together. So the level design, that's your area of expertise, but that leverages the game design, as I said earlier. Like that's like super important that you are chatting with your game designers and using these mechanics in the best possible way and showing off the game the best it can be. Work with your environment artists, because those are the ones that are going to be taking your, kind of crappy cubes and making them something really awesome, right? Making it the final game, which players will see and love and appreciate. And it helps to work together on that. Likewise with narrative, your spaces may need to make sense, which can be really difficult sometimes, but so be it. We can't just shove cars everywhere, is what I learned in Washington, DC on Division. Work with code and tech, because the thing has got to run. No one's going to care about your level if it runs at 3 FPS. No one's, I don't want to. There are games that have come out that don't run very well, and you know them, and it's not a good reputation to have. Work with audio, because they need to know what's going on. Likewise, VFX do, right? If you've got a helicopter going past and then it explodes, like it's not going to be very spectacular if you only tell them at the very end, oh yeah, we need this thing. Like they need to be in that conversation from the very beginning. QA, these folks are they're just very helpful. They're a huge part, like very influential part of the team. These are essentially your first play testers, and they need to know what you're trying to make so that they can test it appropriately and tell you when things aren't working, not just functionally, but like they're playing the game. These are the people that are playing your content more than anyone else. They have a real good insight into what works and what doesn't. And well, you should just pay heed. It's a very important part of the team. And there's a million others that I will have left out, but please tie these things together. You are a designer. Like a key thing, no surprises. We don't want anyone to come into work and be like, what the hell is this? We didn't agree to have an elephant here. Like that works both ways. You don't want to come in and have an artist have changed your layout that was like really perfectly constructed, right? It's no surprises. Make sure everyone's informed. Really key point, I may have sounded like you're kind of ruling the roost. You are so not. You're a facilitator. You're not a dictator. Your job is to make this as smooth as possible for the entire team, to make the game as good as possible. You've got to be passionate about your work, but don't be precious about it. You can't be married to any one idea, because things that work great in your head sometimes just don't work great in practice. And sometimes, sadly, just don't fit with the direction of the game. If you're making something like Division, it's very serious. You're making something like Lego, it's a little bit silly. Make content that reflects the game and let the directors choose where those exceptions happen, because they have the kind of overview that you don't. Remember, everyone wants to make the best game possible. Everyone wants to make it as cool and awesome as possible. And you will probably have already worked with people and you think, oh, why are you doing this? Clearly this is the best course of action. Clearly this will be what makes it work. everyone has a different idea of how to make the best game possible, and that's where the friction comes in, especially between disciplines. But just keep that in mind, because everyone does want to make it as good as possible. And that is what the role of level design is to me. That's what it means to be a level designer. And like I say, this was very processes heavy. If you want to know about good practice for block out or combat design or whatever, there's so much resource out there. Yes, but that is only scratching the surface, as I say. So you're already doing a games course, but you may be thinking, oh, all right, level design sounds cool, level design in particular. How do I get started? Nowadays, there's reams and reams of in-game level editors that you can choose. So I've listed some here. Assassin's Creed has like quest editors and stuff. And even stuff like Fortnite and Minecraft, like the entire game is a level editor. So if you make stuff like this and you put it in your portfolio, these are portfolio pieces, well done. There's actually some really good advantages to using in-game level editors, in that the gameplay is already defined and polished, so you can focus purely on the design. You don't need to be developing or programming character controllers yourself. You can just use them. And the key thing is to make levels and make people play them, watch them play them, ask them to think out loud, and then you can iterate on the levels, iterate. Same with game engines. There are more game engines available just to download than ever before. It's an amazing time to get into games. Unreal, Unity, Godot, Game Maker, more and more and more and more. And yes, you can just, like the Last of Us little thing that I did, that was just in Unreal. That was actually me learning how to use Unreal. Really powerful block out tools for a level designer. So yeah, again, make levels, make people play them, iterate on it. And there's more resources available than ever. So a really good kind of hack that I advise is just get on Twitter and search hashtag level design and hashtag Blocktober. Blocktober is in October, where everyone just shares their block out. So you've got people from like Naughty Dog and stuff showing these really early versions of levels. It's just awesome, really insightful. There's just loads of stuff. YouTube, obviously, there's hours and hours of content. My personal faves are Game Maker's Toolkit, particularly his Boss Keys series on the Zelda dungeons and Metroidvanias, because I love Zelda dungeons and Metroidvanias. And a colleague of mine, Rob Scher, has this level design GDC playlist, very good, in the links that hopefully have been shared. And websites, Gama Sutra, sorry about the name, that's the game industry, old boys club. But it's got loads of good stuff about design. And noclip.website, not to be confused with the excellent documentary series. This is a website where a guy has just reverse engineered all these levels, and you can just view them in browser as if you're in a level editor. So this screenshot I've got is from Portal 2, but it's just in Chrome. Really awesome. You can just snoop around all your favorite levels. And yeah, awesome resource. Have a look while it's up. And yeah, when you're getting your first design job, remember the golden rule: portfolio, 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 all about your portfolio. Okay, thank you very much. That's the end of my talking bit.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Jacob. That was really good. I think you need to take a well-earned drink of water now.
I do.
Welcome to our world. So, can you top your screen share off for us? Oh, yeah. Could you turn your screen share off, Jacob? Sorry. Brilliant. That's great. Okay, so we're going to go over to the Q&A. So if you've got any questions for Jacob based on his great talk there, he shared some really good experience. I was quite excited about the insight into the Lego games, because I love those Lego games, and Dimensions was really good. I really enjoyed that. So I thought it was a really interesting concept, the whole thing. So yeah, we've got some questions I think in there already, but if anybody else wants to ask a question, feel free to pop it in there and we'll ask some questions. So this first question is from Tom Lowe, and he says, how closely do you work with narrative designers when it comes to designing environments? So what comes first, I guess? Does the narrative come first and then the environment, or is it the environment that then sort of dictates what happens with the narrative? Is it like an organic thing where both things work together? That's an interesting one as well.
It's a really good question. Yeah, so it depends. Again, this is such a typical thing. It depends on the project. It depends on the particular game. But like if you're working on something like The Division, like that's a really narrative and environment detail heavy game. And so it's a core consideration from the very beginning in something like that. Like each zone has a theme, right? And that works for the environment art and the narrative. And so that feeds into the design. And so you've got to constantly be pushing those things. But it's very much a collaboration. So I worked super closely with narrative on Division stuff, particularly for like mission content, because that's like explicitly narrative, but also just like in the world in general. Oh, this is the street with all the trash piled up. Why? Oh, it's because these apartments there, like odd little things like that. And that can be a lot the kind of remit of the environment artists and the narrative designers themselves. Like in a company like Ubisoft, it's so big, like there's so many roles. You've got real specialists. But if we take it back to something like TT, you're very much the driving force of that yourself as a designer, because you're the one researching different IPs and bringing in the different things and being like, right, we want to reference this tree from Adventure Time. We want to reference like so many things. So yeah, it's very much a collaboration.
And when you're doing, let's say you're doing something like Division, you mentioned about going on the Google thing and sort of mapping out things like that. As a level designer, do you actually go out and get like photographic references for things as well, or are you doing it purely based on research from the internet?
So something like the Division, again, working at Ubisoft, they have they do like research trips, and but like usually reserved for leads and seniors and stuff, not lowly little designers like me at the time. But they gather an awful lot of photos. So one thing that you can't get so much from Google is pictures of back alleys and stuff. And obviously in Division, we want everything. And like that helps with the feel of the city. So a lot of the pictures from the research trips were just of like trash in alleys and like chain link fences and just, odd little things like that. And yes, it's enormously helpful. Any real world inspiration you can is, going there is better than Google, but Google's a really good second choice.
Yeah, I mean, I try and get the students to take photographs on their phones all the time and just take pictures of random things because it will be useful at some point in their life.
Absolutely. When I'm out and about and I just see an interesting looking building or just like a weird set of like ledges and stuff, like anything like that. I love that. I've got a folder on my phone of exactly that kind of thing. It's super useful just to flick through.
It's a good habit to get into, definitely. Okay, so we've got a technical question now. How long roughly does it take out to block out a level?
Again, I'm really sorry. It depends on the level. It depends on a lot. Have you seen those like pictures of like 30 seconds, 3 minutes, half an hour, 3 hour, like of like sketches of like Spider-Man or whatever, and it's like the 30-second one's rubbish, but then obviously the 3 hour one's really good. It's very much like that. A level never really feels finished to me as a designer. I always want to keep doing it. And like the more you do it, like the more you kind of see the cracks in it and you're like, oh, I wish we'd done this, but now it's too late. You know what I mean? Like it's an ongoing process. For something like Division missions, ideally the designers would have like a month's head start on the artists to really have enough time to kind of experiment and explore, and then nail it down to something pretty good, and then start working with the artists on the nitty gritty. But it depends on project, it depends on game, it depends on level, it depends on a lot.
Is it hard to let it go? When you're working on a level, because I'm, from my creative things, I always kind of like, I could tweak it a little bit more, I could do a little bit more. But for you, obviously, when you're working to a deadline, it might not necessarily be quite where you want it to be, but you've got to let it go at that point. Is that difficult to do?
Yes, and it's a very familiar feeling, and it's pretty much everywhere I've worked. Like, like a game is never finished. At some point, you just have to decide to stop and ship it, and that's how like levels feel in particular. Because like one of the reasons I love level design is that it's such a visual and physical part of the game. Like you're not just coding, like you're not just optimizing something, or you're not just making some leaves wobble and stuff. This was all my fears when I was like heading down that programming path. Like when you can make a level, it's like you can go to this place in the game world and you can be like, this is my place, right? It's awesome. But like, yeah, it's very much your baby, and you gotta let go at some point.
Yeah, it's always difficult. Whatever creative process you work on, that's difficult.
Absolutely.
So I've got, actually, this is a good question that leads on from that one then. So do you have a favourite game that you've worked on? So maybe we could refine that to a favourite level as well of that game. So if it's a favourite game you worked on, what was your favourite level of that bit?
It's such a difficult question to answer. I'm bad at favourites in general. That Sonic world in Lego Dimensions was awesome to work on. I've always been a Sonic guy as a kid. Like that was like my parents won a Mega Drive when I was 2, and it came with Sonic, and that's it. Like fast forward 30 years now working in games. So getting to work on Lego Sonic was awesome. I got to, like, I made this whole thing about the research. I didn't have to do a research phase for Sonic. I already had it all in my head, which was great. And we got to do more or less everything I wanted to do. Again, if we'd had another 6 weeks, it would have been incredible. What we released with the time that we had and the resources we had was awesome. But more recently, working on Division 2, we got to work on DLC missions. And while the kind of base game was really like, you really have to nail that feeling and stuff. And I was working on an early zone, so there wasn't much room for stuff to be too out there because that would come later. Working on these DLC missions, we got to do some really distinct stuff. We got to really play with the lore and the world. And so that's where, that screenshot of that hub room in the cave and stuff, and that's inspired by a real data center that's in Stockholm, not in Washington, DC, that's designed to look like a bond layer, right? So it's like, see that reference picture, and it's like, well, if that can be in Stockholm, could be under Washington, DC, we can play with that lore and really push that. And it was awesome. And then we got to make a level in a nightclub as well. And that was great because I was working with narrative to be like, I really want to make a level in a nightclub, but why would a nightclub be functioning 10 months after the apocalypse? Essentially, it's like, but what if they're growing plants for this drug that they use that we can then explore in the collectibles? You know what I mean? Like, and it all worked together, and it was awesome. So yeah.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, I suppose, looking at it now in terms of all the lockdown stuff. These things still, I was amazed when hairdressers were like illegal hairdressers opened up, didn't they? And were doing illegal haircuts because so if they can open up, I'm sure that given that circumstance, some sort of nightclubs and things like that will open up in that circumstance. Definitely.
Really, really bizarre looking at the real world pandemic response and comparing it to Division, because it's just eerily accurate a lot of the time. Tents and vaccination centers and stuff, like very strange year, as I'm sure we're all aware.
I definitely have had some parallels with that game. So I guess this links in again to those questions. This is more about the sort of difficulties and the challenges. So in terms of theory, what level has posed the most challenges when you've been designing it for you? Which is the one that you were glad to hand on?
That's a really great question. It's a shame that I can't talk about my current project because it's very challenging. So I'll have to come back in a year or something. In my experience, every time has presented a unique challenge. So everything's a little different. And I'm sorry if this feels like a cop-out answer, but like, again, it depends so much. So on Mission Impossible and LEGO Dimensions, if you've seen the Mission Impossible series, and I really like the films, but like for me, there's a very clear pecking order, and it's like 4, 5, 6 are way better than 1, 2, 3. 2 in particular is trash. 1 is pretty good. 3 is pretty good, but 4, 5, 6 like really good films. But for whatever reason on licensing, we just weren't allowed to use them, and I really tried to like push it and get away with it and stuff, but you can't. Like, this is a lesson to be learned. Like you can't. A lot of the time, you just can't get away with that kind of thing. So we had to like, just as the design was locked down and was about to be arted up, I had to change the entire thing, take out the Burj Khalifa and replace it with just like some windmills or whatever. Conversely, working on Sonic, we had to make Sonic's movement work, and that was a huge challenge. And we had to design the world before Sonic's movement was locked down. So there was no metrics. I didn't know how long it would take Sonic to get from A to B. I didn't know how far his jump would take him, this kind of thing. So if you play that world with that in mind, you can probably then tell that a lot of it was guesswork, which is, again, a shame. But like, a lot of the time you're making stuff, you're designing the level while the game mechanics are still being pinned down, which is very challenging because, it's a chicken and egg situation. Contrast with something like Division 2, where we had the first Division game, thankfully, as a really good template. So we knew the core gameplay, but then a lot of the challenge came in terms of content and how do we keep this content fresh? How do we make it exciting? If the player is meant to play this, for a 30-hour campaign and then play it for another 500 hours as a games as a service title, right? Like, how do we, like I say, leverage those environments in different ways with different activities, different setups and stuff to keep it exciting and keep players coming back? Every role is challenging, and they all have their own,
Yeah, but also rewarding as well, obviously.
Oh, absolutely. So, yeah. I wouldn't trade this for any other job. I don't know how to do any other job, so I've got no choice.
So another one here. This is something again that certainly we try and get through to students to do iterations. So it's from Morgan. How often do you throw around different level design ideas in terms of deciding what's best for a specific game? So I suppose it's really a question about iteration. How many iterations? I guess that will also depend on the project, won't it? But maybe give us some examples.
The ideal situation is that you have enough kind of pre-production time to kind of to just do this a lot. Like, this is a super important phase, and so much of the job is like, you think you know what you're doing, and then you try it out, and it just doesn't work. And being able to get an engine and try a bunch of different things and figure out what works is just enormously helpful. There was a talk by Titanfall dev about action blocks, which is what they did for Titanfall 2, which is where they just did loads and loads of little mini prototypes, and they could just take from all these different prototypes and kind of stitch them together to figure out what works in their levels. And Titanfall 2 is an excellent campaign, especially for level design. It's just all these different ideas that, emphasize the core gameplay of, like running, shooting, wall running, the rest of it, Titans. But like amp it up to 11, right? And that's how they did it. They took that phase, that prototype phase, and pushed it to 11. Sometimes you work on a project where you don't have that time, and it's really difficult, and you've got to try and crunch that, right? You got to kind of think, okay, well, if I had loads of time, I'd try this, this, and this, and I think this is the best idea, so we'll try this. But the more you work on a project, you will find the more you're thinking about it, and the more you're kind of running through these situations in your head. And after you've made one level for a particular game, you learn so much about what does and doesn't work that it can inform your later ones. And you get these kind of ideas in the back of your head. Oh, I want to try this. Oh, I want to try this. Like, we've got zip lines. I want to try a level all about zip lines, like odd little things like that.
So another one that ties into, again, the theory of level design, does it change your job when it's an open world? Is it a different experience to being, something like the Sonic game, which presumably was all individual levels and there was a definite end to the level? When it's an open world, there isn't really an end to the level, is there?
Yeah. So weirdly, my experience has been mostly open worlds since I joined the industry, which has been a source of mild frustration for me, because I prefer linear games nowadays. Like, I like a nice contained experience. The short answer is yes, it does change it. And it's because you've got to, again, depending on the game, but like, so a very general thing is that you've got to consider this 360 approach, right? And that means that when you've got an event or an activity in the world, how do you kind of skew the approaches to that so that no matter where the player's coming from, they get kind of the best introduction to it? Unlike a linear game where it's like, well, the player's going to go over this ledge and it's going to be beautifully framed and it's going to look amazing. It's like, instead, it's like, oh, the player's going to like fly in from over there maybe, and how do we draw their attention and how do we make this work? Something I learned a lot on The Division was when to be a little more heavy-handed, and this can be difficult to learn, but it's something they do. So Division is led by a studio called Massive in Sweden, and we were like a satellite studio, kind of just working with them on that property. But they were really good. Their design is really adept at being like, this approach doesn't work, let's just chop it off. Let's just block it up with, it's post-apocalypse, let's block it up with trash and a fence. And so the player can't go that way because it's not an optimal route. Instead, we push them over here. And, there's all kinds of techniques to do that, like lighting. And often it's weird when you start paying attention how many just straight up arrows there are in games just pointing you in a particular direction and stuff. And that's, players mostly don't notice it, but it like really
semantics, isn't it? It's very simple stuff, yeah. And like the flaming barrel thing, the old flaming barrel things in the old
absolutely
games,
were, yeah, just draw you from spot to spot. And it changed. Open world's very different beast, but like you get a knack for it, and that's it. It's about drawing the player in, and it's those core things I said earlier, like making sure players don't get lost, making sure they've got these landmarks so that when they walk down a street in the world, it's like, all right, I know where I am in relation to everything else because I've seen this before. I know this is back there, stuff like that.
Good, yeah, fantastic. I've got a couple of questions, sort of portfolio based now as well. This is quite an interesting one. So unfortunately, it's anonymous, this one as well, so I can't credit the student because it's a really good question. So with level design, you recommend adding level from things like Halo or Trials Evolution into your portfolio, this person's made some levels in those sort of things and wants to know if that's a good idea to put those sort of things in your portfolio as well as your actual physical design work that you've done.
In my opinion, absolutely. And level design is much like everything else, where there will be gatekeepers that you've got to deal with, right? Who might be a little bit elitist about these things. But in my opinion, those people aren't worth your time. If you've designed a level, right, it doesn't matter what tool set you've used. If it's a good level, that will speak for itself, right? So Halo, absolutely. If you've made a great Trials level, absolutely. Like the key thing is when you put this in your portfolio, is treat it like any other piece of content. Say what you set out to do, what you ended up doing, what you learned from it, and you've got videos, you've got of key moments. If you can give an actual demo, if you can actually let people play it, that's all the better. But in my opinion, absolutely, yes. It's like I say, like the gameplay is already locked down. You don't need to worry about all this extra stuff. You can focus on the design when you're using one of these level editors in a game. So why not? That's very much my opinion. But I think it's the right one. So.
I think it's really good. Yeah, I mean, certainly my experience as a young person into games was doing levels for Quake and Doom and things like that. And I think those things do open doorways. I've got a question now from Chris Walton, who's one of our course leaders. So he runs the tech course at Confetti, and he's saying, from your personal experience for a portfolio, would you encourage showing just final pieces, or would you encourage the students to show the developmental focus as well? Some people, by their very nature, just want to show the final pieces because they're the good pieces, obviously, and they don't want to show the developmental work. And we have so many problems with students, like when they do the developmental work, just throwing it away or just getting rid of it or deleting it. We're trying to encourage them to keep that. So be interested to hear your take on it.
Yeah, the kind of traditional advice on this is that your portfolio should be a collection of the things that you're proudest of, right? And so your best work. When you're just starting out, like when I was just starting out, I didn't have much of that. And that's why I did that game a week thing, right? And a key part of that is that I showed my process for each of those. Like I showed, like I've got little GIFs of my view in editor as I'm figuring out cameras and stuff. And so that stuff is hidden on my portfolio currently because I've got like production work that I can show off, but I've given those links that link to my old portfolio because it's still up there, just not explicitly linked, so that you can have a look at that. In my opinion, if you yes, like you should show that stuff off because it's super insightful, and what it becomes is a talking point in interviews. Like we talked about my game a week projects in interviews because they showed that I was interested in mechanics, not just in pure programming or whatever. And even when I was applying for design jobs, they were talking points because, again, it was that focus on design. And I've got my university projects on there as well, and they're all very computing-y. But again, they show that value in that, like, can you do this particular job, like this technical thing? Yes, here's all the results from that. I would say yes, but your focus should always be on like your best bits, but then like any kind of in development stuff can just serve another purpose, and that's showing your process, which is, again, super important that you can do that process.
So another one kind of leads off that, again, related to this sort of portfolio interview thing. Somebody's asking here, again, an anonymous one. What kind of questions did you get asked for your interview for the job on level design? And did you have to do a technical test as well? And if you did, what kind of thing did that involve? Because we've obviously got a lot of students who are going to be in that position very shortly, at the end of the year potentially. So I think it's really useful information for them.
Yes, level design interviews can be quite varied, and they're always exciting affairs. A lot of the time, you're asked questions that are very broad, which I find personally difficult to answer. So I've prepared answers for them, and it's stuff like, "What's a good level?" or "What makes a good level?" or "Describe your process." And with those first two, I just find it very broad. So I start talking about stuff that I've talked about in this talk about like landmarks and such. When I'm asked like, what's my process? It's like, well, a lot of the time the process is dictated by the studio that I'm in. So, man, what is my process? But that's when I came across this kind of research, planning, design, scripting, polish. Like there is definitely a process there. As for tests, they are not so much technical tests, but design tests are very much a thing, especially nowadays. And So some application processes nowadays can be very intensive, and it's just the age-old problem of there's more applicants than there is jobs, right? So I guess they can kind of take those liberties. I've done a lot of design tests. I've done a lot of interview processes. Even now, you know, like when I was applying for jobs after uni last year, like there's a lot out there, and there's a lot to be done. Sorry, I'm rambling. Design tests, good design tests will be time boxed to an afternoon or something like that, and there will be odd little questions like, we've made this game recently, design like a top-down view of a level for this game along this theme, okay? Or well, that's more or less it. It's usually some variant of give us a bit of a design. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you've got tests where it's like, we'll give you a week's deadline, but we expect it to be done within 3 days. But in the back of your head, you're thinking, well, I want this job, so I'm going to spend a whole week on it. And very easy to spend a lot of time on these things. And that's when you're like blocking out a whole thing, and like you're putting together slides to show off like, oh, in this moment, like an explosion will happen. And, you know, and then you end up with this fully blocked out level, and you put so much time into it, and then you send it off and it might be a no. And that's happened to me several times, which can be really difficult. So yes, be prepared. But yeah, kind of for interviews, get your big questions sorted out. So what does make a good level? What is your process? And then that collaboration thing is super important. When is a time that you've had to work with someone or on something where these two aspects haven't aligned? How have you figured that out? Like, have some examples for all this stuff lined up, because it's super important.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. We've got some questions now about the process. We've got another anonymous one. What tools, software do you use to block out a level? Do you sketch it on paper first and then go into the engine, or do you just go straight into the engine first to do it?
Great question. And every designer you ask will have a different answer to it, which is super helpful. Some people are really intense on the paper design. I wish I could break my NDA. Let me, no. Basically, for me personally, I do a little bit of paper first, but it is so rough, and like no one but me knows what it is, right? And it usually often looks like circles and a line and, you know, circle here and stuff. And in my head, that's like, this is the flow that I want. In fact, I can do a real quick one, which will be rubbish. But like, it literally, so that cave level looks like that, right? Because it's like, I want the level to kind of start there, go into a thing and branch off into 3 things. And anyone else looking at this will be like, this is a level design. No, it's not really, but it helps you figure out those kind of big questions early. Like, this is that planning phase. Like, it helps you just get something formal done and figure it out early. And then, yes, my ideal situation is that my tools allow me to hop into engine as soon as possible and start getting a feel for those things. Because once you're in there and you're at the scale with the character and stuff, it's like, oh, right, this doesn't quite work. Or, oh, but if I tweak this, it'll work better, that kind of thing. And it can kind of be a little bit of a back and forth. I've got, my desk is a complete mess, but I've got sketches of just different like styles of layout, because it's just quicker to do a quick sketch sometimes than it is to go in and wiggle stuff around. So for me, it's very much a back and forth, but very rough paper designs. Whereas some people get graph paper and compasses out and do the whole thing. It's just whatever works for you is the right answer, really.
Yeah, and I think it's that first phase. It really only needs to work for you, doesn't it? Because no one else is going to see that first phase of idea generation.
Absolutely.
We've inadvertently answered Sam Baverstock's question there as well, because his question was, how do you start a level design? He never knows where to begin, and how do you overcome creative block? And I think that's pretty much answered that question in that technique there. But if you've got anything else for Sam, that's great.
Yeah, like the creative block thing is definitely a real thing. And my answer for that is to just kind of, I don't know if this is like a good answer. I kind of force myself to go through the motions. So if paper's not working for me at that time, like I'll get it down to basics. I'll just draw out shapes, random shapes, and then I'll be like, does any of this speak to me? And then I'll get an engine and I'll try one of these shapes. It's like, oh, but if I tweak this, or if I tweak the entrance, you know, just try and get, for me, I try and get a shape that feels exciting, or I then go back to my research phase and try and find some reference material that looks exciting. So something I didn't mention much is that, like, in that research phase, it's really good to just get pictures, just get loads of pictures, get them in some kind of board. I use Pure Ref, which is like a tool where you can just put pictures everywhere and zoom in and zoom out and label them and stuff, and pictures on pictures on pictures. And then if you've got enough of this stuff, you can then you have this kind of library to just flick through at your leisure and be like, oh, maybe I could do something with that, or oh, that's an interesting layout, maybe I could do something like that. It goes back to what we were saying earlier about taking pictures. If you've got a folder on your phone with just weird pictures of weird architecture and stuff, you can just flick through that and be like, all right, this could be interesting, maybe I can use that.
Fantastic. Yeah. So we've got a good question from Toby here as well. Toby, actually, what sort of things do you implement in your level so that players don't get lost, or when they do get lost, how can you get them back on track?
Yeah, this is a huge topic, and yeah, there's a lot of resource out there for exactly this kind of thing, because it's such a core thing. So if you go back to basics and you're looking at level design techniques for stuff like this, it will come down to a lot of lineup where your player enters a space so that they can see the exit, that kind of thing. If you can't see the exit, make sure there's light coming through. Use lighting to your advantage. Use colors, kind of point things in that direction so that players know where they're going. Sometimes you don't have that luxury because you're in an open world or something, and in that case you need to use elevation to your advantage. Can you put it slightly higher up so that it's on the player's eye line, this kind of thing. If players are already lost, it depends on the game. If you play like a Naughty Dog game and you don't know where to go for a while, if you wait about 10 minutes, it'll come up with a little hint, and then your AI companion will be like, hey, have you tried looking over here? You know, like other games will do it less subtly, like Ubisoft games will often just have a map, a UI blip, right? That's just like a literal diamond over a doorway, like, please go to this door. And these things are not like amazing solutions, but they are solutions. And sometimes that's it. It's a whole thing. It's a whole bag of worms, can of worms. It can be a bag of worms, a big bag. But like, yeah, use everything you've got. Like if you've got like some VFX budget and you put some sparks over there, so it's like anything to draw the eye. Movement draws the eye, light draws the eye, contrast draws the eye. And if you've got characters literally lead you through the level. Naughty Dog do that all the time. If you play Uncharted or Last of Us, your AI companion will literally be leading you through the level half the time, whether you realize it or not.
Also, I guess, again, briefly sort of tapping into what you just said there about the audio element, we've got a really good question from John Wilkinson here. How much do you think about sound when you're designing a level? Does that influence how you plan out the level? And do you have ideas about how sound can be used in the level, and is that then given to the sound department, or is it just not something that you think about?
It's something that should be thought about, and honestly should be thought about more earlier. Audio is a really tricky thing in games. It's often the kind of last thing in the queue, right? Because that's the way the workflow kind of works. If you lock down sounds too early, things are going to move, right? And then so audio has to move, audio has to change and stuff. It just requires a lot of work if it's done too early. So they often end up at the end of the queue, which isn't great for any audio designers. That they'll often have a kind of hollow look in their eyes. Joking. But like, yes, it's difficult. Ideally, you'll be thinking about it early, and ideally you'll be having that conversation early. Like I say, if you've got like 10 slides put together and you're like, these are the key bits of the level I want, and you've invited a range of people, then that means that your audio designer will be there and they will be taking notes and being like, all right, this might be tricky, this might be good. Or like, you want to be talking to the kind of domain experts at that point, so they can bounce off each other, they can feedback on that stuff and help you out. In my experience, yes, that one's a little bit less. That usually ends up a little bit less on my plate and a little bit more on environment art and the audio side. But like for key things, it's absolutely a consideration, and it's one of those things that you can leverage to lead players around a level. Yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think, when you said about the cave level and the nightclub level, obviously my mind as an audio person as well thinks, well, there's some great audio opportunities there, especially in the nightclub one,
The nightclub was a great example. So thank you for reminding me. Like, yes, we had to have those conversations as early as possible. So it's like, okay, we've got sign off for a nightclub. get chatting with who's going to be doing my audio first off, because there's like 500 people in Sweden. It's like, okay, this guy, we want to have music, we want to have good music, not game music, we want to have good music, and it needs to work like this. And that brought up so many, like, you wouldn't expect. Like, audio is really tricky in games, and so many implementation hurdles to overcome just to having this diegetic, music in the level and stuff. And can we sync it up with the lights? No, but can we fake it? Yes. Okay. That kind of thing. Like, yes, have those conversations as early as possible.
It's interesting because obviously it breaks the illusion as well if it's not quite right. We have expectations, don't we, whether we realise it or not, of these environments that are created. So
absolutely, it can totally kill it. So yes, it needs to be spot on.
Yeah. Okay, I've got a good question here from Jaden. Now, Jaden's very much into sort of physical modelling. So he does railways and tabletop games and things like that. And he's sort of saying, is it useful to make a physical model of a level before you start to design it in level, rather than sketching it out on paper, actually physically make a small maquette, a model of it? Is that a process that's useful or not?
So that's super interesting. There's a lot of crossover with design in general with stuff like D&D and tabletop games and stuff. Like, it's very like D&D is all design. Like, as a DM, you're just designing an experience for your players, right? And yeah, tabletop gaming and stuff, it all ties in. My only trepidation would be that if you make a physical level, it can be very difficult to then change it and adapt it. If you make it in modular pieces, that helps, and it'll work better for some games than others. So if you're making like Binding of Isaac or Zelda style thing, like top down 2D, and you can move those rooms around and stuff, and that's something that I've done, like cut out bits of paper to represent rooms and shuffle them around, because you can do that really quickly. If you're making full models and stuff, it can be less, well, it can just be more difficult to just change things when things need to be changed. That's the thing that I'd be wary of. But I mean, that'd be very cool. I'd love to see some like physical models of stuff that I've made. That would be great.
Yeah, be fantastic, wouldn't it? It kind of it brings things to life in a sort of more three-dimensional way than normal paper drawing, doesn't it? So
yeah. I mean, I've got, like I say, my desk is super messy. I've got cutouts of things so that I can draw a level on paper as a base and then move the different elements around. That's definitely a thing that I've done. So
yeah, great. So good question here from Jake Benbow. This is about, I suppose, a part of the process again, but this is a different part of the process. This is the bit where we tell students constantly, I'm going to ruin games for you now. Yeah. You're never going to be able to play a game in the same way. So what's your process for studying a level while you're playing the game?
God, that rings so true, because I remember like sitting in like English class and stuff and thinking, no one like analyzes these books like this. Like, like I just want to read. But then the more that I got into making stuff, the more that I found myself analyzing everything by default, which is super annoying. But like, it's also like a key part of the process, right? And you get the different, like, you appreciate things in a new way. So yes, while I'm playing games, I often have this kind of background process running that's doing exactly that. It's trying to boil down, for me, it's a lot of the time trying to boil down like the weird little things that you as a player shouldn't be thinking about too much. So if I'm playing a game for the purpose of research, I will be looking at core stuff, level layout. What are they doing here? So I was recently playing Doom 2016, which is one of my favorite games, and just looking at how they design their arenas. And it's like, okay, so the start's really simple. Player always has the high ground. You drop in, so you can see what the level is, and then you drop in and then you play it. And it's usually a bunch of loops and pretty simple and stuff, right? And you get a few levels in, and there's this giant pit in the middle of the floor, and it's like, oh, a giant pit, that's a good idea. Take these different elements, but then like start zooming in on individual weird little bits. So like, how do enemies spawn in this game? So when I was interviewing for the Ubisoft job, I'd never played The Division before. I didn't have time to get my hands on it before I did the test for that, which was block out a Division level, right? Which I did in SketchUp because I knew how to use SketchUp. But one of the things that I was looking at while I was watching these videos is like, where do the enemies come from? Because in Lego games, we can just have them come out of a portal, no one cares. Like, but in something like Division, it's realistic. Where do the enemies come from? They all come out of closets. That's where they come from. So I saw in one of these videos that there were just guys just pouring out of this closet. So in my design then, I referenced closets, like spawn here, spawn here, spawn here. And that came up in my interview. It was like, wow, we're really impressed that you considered this, because most applicants don't bother, right? And it's just like, yeah, I was, I want this to, like, this is meant to be a facsimile of a functional level. it needs to function. What are the functions of the level? Where do enemies come from? What makes them spawn in? Is it the player walking into a trigger? Is it the player taking out so many enemies? Yeah, and like when you walk into a space, how is it laid out for the player? Where are the elements that you're going to be using as a player? How does the game introduce you to them? I'm playing Lost Legacy at the moment, the Uncharted game, and it's super good. Like just the kind of Breath of the Wild style view that you get of these like big open space and being like landmark, but then like what's the route to the landmark? Like analyzing how they lead you through, and it's like, oh, this is the place with the droopy trees, this is the place with the blossoming trees, like all these little things. Like, yeah, again, that's like a huge topic all in itself, but like, yeah, that's I hope that made sense.
No, it did. Yeah, really good. And it's those visual cues, isn't it, that make it feel different, in certain areas. I think that's the interesting thing about games now, as we've moved into sort of more graphically intensive games. We've lost that kind of like, wrong, that's the end of the level. There's a really obvious end to the level. Now it kind of blends in a little bit, doesn't it? And I suppose open world games are just emphasizing that, really. It's not really an open world game, is it? Because it's still a series of levels or a series of missions, but it's just taking place in different areas that are subtly different. So
exactly. A lot of the modern ones, you'll notice that you have these things set in the open world, but then you go to a specific bit and it's essentially a self-contained level, and they do little things to keep you in there. And sometimes it's less subtle, like you've got that like you're leaving the mission zone kind of message, but that's done a lot of the time for a technical reason, because like having all these systems interfering with missions is really difficult. But for a design reason, it just keeps the thing focused, and 99% of players won't wander away, so you can get away with it. But yeah, absolutely.
Red Dead's a good example, isn't it, of that? Is it the way that opens different bits of the map?
I've got a lot of opinions about Red Dead 2. We shouldn't get into that game.
I've got some questions now about the students and their sort of advice for them. So this is from Deborah. What's the main advice you would give to somebody who's currently studying at college, university? Any tips on motivation or time management that helped you when it came to assignments?
Again, what a topic. University is tough, like education in general, getting these things done. In terms of time management and stuff, I'd say for me, what works is make a load of lists, because everything's like this big intimidating job until you like break it down and just be like, all right, if I just do this bit today, then I can do this. Actually, preparing for this talk is a great example. So we kind of pinned it down like a while ago, but I've had a lot on. I've just moved into this new place, started a new job, but like it's like, okay, what do I need to do? Well, I need to figure out what I'm talking about. What am I going to talk about? And then get out a bunch of ideas, like compartmentalize. Big jobs are just lots of little jobs. You just need to identify what the little jobs are and then do them one at a time. And that's easier said than done, but like I don't have any magic formula for that, unfortunately. And find your flow, find what works for you. If you work best at 7 a.m., great. If you work best at 11 p.m., do that. You can't do that so much in an office, but like, yeah.
I suppose that's the luxury at the moment with us being in this kind of crazy situation where we're not really at work. You can work at different times at the moment, so maybe that might carry forward into post.
Yeah, well, I mean, like this, my new role at Roll 7, they've been a fully remote studio for about 5 years now, something like that, and they've got it really locked down. It's really, really refreshing and really nice. And I've set up my home office and stuff, and it's just like really nice. It's like, wow, I could do this probably for the rest of my life. It's a nice way to work.
Yeah. I've got a question from Josh Basteresh. He says, how were you able to network as a fresh graduate? And again, probably some tips on that aspect of it for students that are just about to leave university now.
Yeah, I don't actually have a good answer for this, because when I graduated, I wasn't very good at that. And like, so I guess I can frame that in an encouraging way. You don't need to be good at that to get like a game role. You don't need to be going in these kind of social circles or whatever. I had an advantage, so I had my placement at Sony, and I knew some guys from that. But like, they weren't. You can't just click your fingers and get your friend a job, right? Apart from in 2008, that one time, before the company went under. Maybe that's why they went under, right? But like, yeah, it's a tough one. I I don't know. I'm sorry. I think a really good tool that we've got nowadays is Twitter. I know that that might be like social media. I know, but there's so many people on there talking about level design, game development in general. Like you can. That's what I do. I've got this huge list of just game developers that I just follow and keep my finger on the pulse. And sometimes it's people talking rubbish, but sometimes it's really good stuff, and you'll learn about events like this one and such. As a new graduate, I've got no magic formula. It's just do what you can, but don't be disheartened if you're like not like going to like, what do we imagine, like these industry cocktail parties or something. Like some people are really good at flying in circles like that, but like not everyone is, and you don't need to land a job. So don't sweat it too much, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's good advice. So the next, well, this will be the final question actually, because we're nearly out of time for questions. Two people have asked a very similar question, so I'm going to amalgamate their question into one gestalt question. So Sonny and Jake. So they're basically asking, from your sort of, not from a game that you've worked on, but from your experience as a gamer, what would you consider the holy grail of level design? What game have you played where you've gone, I'm in tears, this is the most beautiful level I've ever played in my life?
What a great question. This is the kind of question you can get asked in interviews as well, which is weird that I struggle with it, because it's essentially asking what's your like favorite game and stuff if you're a design focused. For me, it's a bunch of the classics. So I think Naughty Dog do really good level design. You 9 times out of 10 know where you're going. You know what you're doing, and it's beautifully framed, beautifully introduced and stuff. And they've got so much budget for like I say, just like their characters leading you around and the environment's just being beautiful and incredible. We can go back a bit, and we go back to like when Valve used to make games, like Portal 2, awesome, incredible. For me personally, Metroid Prime was my favorite game for like 20 years or something. I love Metroid Prime. Still waiting for that HD remake. Come on.
Yeah.
But like that world, I was like 13 when I played that. Just like, I'd never experienced anything like it in a game. It was awesome. And then leading on from that, Zelda games. I love Zelda games. I love like traditional Zelda games. So I love Wind Waker. Like just like being on the open sea and seeing these things in the distance is amazing. But then we come more recent and we get Breath of the Wild, and like that's not like an empty ocean. That's like this world where around every corner there's just something to do, whether it's a little Korok puzzle or a huge divine beast or like shrines which are in between. There's always something to do in that world. I could play Breath of the Wild probably for the rest of my life and never get bored. Incredible game. Yes.
Yeah, no, great examples, really good. Similar to my own, actually. I think Breath of the Wild's a brilliant game, and graphically it's amazing as well, isn't it? It just looks so beautiful.
It's just beautifully made all over. It's just Nintendo at the top of their game with that kind of title.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Well, thanks very much, Jacob. It's been a really fantastic talk and a really great Q&A at the end of that. Hopefully the students have really got some great information from that, and you shared some really valuable insights with us, I think.
Awesome.
We've got some more events today, students. So we've got the board game jam going on today. So you can join in on that and producing a board game in one day, prototype at least. We've got Wodge from CD Projekt Red coming up straight after this one at 11 o'clock. We've also got Callum Hancock from Cloud Imperium today, Sam Cook from Esports Insiders around today as well, and Industry Week veteran Andy Davis is also around later on today. So there's plenty of other talks for you to go to. If you haven't booked into those talks, you can go onto the Industry Week website and book in. That's the end of the session now. So if you'd like to give Jacob a lovely round of applause virtually in the chat, usually at this point lots of chat comments and saying thank you and stuff, so have a look in the chat, Jacob, if you're not already, if it's not there. Hopefully they'll be appreciative of your talk. If you can hang around, Jacob, at the end of the talk so we can just do the debrief. And if the students, once you've done your thank you to Jacob, if you can log yourself out of the meeting, that would be great, just so we can get out as quickly as possible so we can just talk to Jacob at the end. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for tuning in.